Hello and welcome to the walkthrough for GPRO Quality Reporting 2019 for Doctors ACO. I'm Amy Thompson and I'm going to show you how to submit your quality data for the 2019 quality reporting. You're going to start here at the Doctors ACO website. Go to doctorsaco.org and then here under Coordinated Quality Healthcare you'll see the BlueSky login link. Click on that. That will bring you to the BlueSky Analytics website. For our purposes today, we're going to use a demo version of the BlueSky Analytics website so that we're not showing you any actual patient information. Everything that you will see today is scrambled patient information. Your username is always going to be your email address. I'm going to type that in. And then if you have forgotten your password, if it's been a minute since you've logged in, or if this is the first time you're logging in, you can hit the reset password link down here at the bottom. This will send an email to the email address that is your username with a link to follow to reset your password. So pretty easy to do. I'm going to type in my password here. And log in. The first page it brings you to is your ACO Insights page for your practice. You'll see all the claims data for your practice, and you can play around with that anytime you'd like. But today, the menus that we're going to use over here on the left-hand side is the GPRO menu. We're going to start at GPRO Progress. So click on GPRO Progress. And I'm going to sort this for just one practice today, since most of you will just be seeing one practice. So you'll see the name of your practice, and then you'll see the total number of charts chosen for chart audits this year for GPRO. If you click on that number, it brings you up with the list of patients that were chosen. You have the option over here in the top right to export to Excel or PDF if you would like to print this for your records, or if you need to pull paper charts or anything like that, you can always print this list of patients here. One thing to keep in mind when you're navigating through BlueSky is you never want to use the back arrow on your browser. If you want to go back to your previous screen, you use the X up here in the top right corner in the green bar. So we're going to click that X to go back to our GPRO Progress page. So start here every day when you start capturing data. You want to check the number of incomplete charts. You see that this practice has only completed a couple of them, so still 97% incomplete. As you enter information, it will change over to captured. Once you send them to the ACO for approval, you'll see numbers here in the for approval column. One place that you always want to look every day when you log in is this not approved column. If you send something to the ACO, and for example, you have told us that the patient did not have a mammogram, but we were able to find a claim for mammograms, we would not approve that chart. We would write a note to you of when and where that mammogram claim was found, so you can reach out and get the report and complete that patient's chart, and then have the option to change your answers and update that. So always check out, see if you have anything in this not approved category. You will also get an email each morning if any charts have been not approved the day before. Your goal is to have 100% here in the for submission category, and then once everything is ready for submission, the ACO will send all the charts to CMS, and eventually we will be 100% CMS accepted. As you scroll over here, the very last column for QA, this is the charts that we are choosing for quality assurance. If you have any in here, then these patients, this means that we basically need to see your work. You're going to need to print out or take screenshots of your EHR so that you can show us the proof of all the answers that you have put down for your chart audits. So after we have checked the GPRO Progress each day, then we're going to go to the GPRO Submission menu on the left-hand side. And this will be the list of all the patients and which measures they were chosen for. As you sit down to start putting in your information and doing your chart checks, there are two cheat sheets, measure summaries that you're going to need to have in front of you, and I'm going to show you what those look like. So this is the ACO measure summary chart for 2019. This should look familiar for everyone that's done the training already. This has all of the measures for GPRO this year. There are 10 of them. Goes into details on each of the measures, all exclusions for each of the measures, date ranges, everything that you would need to be able to properly fill out these measures. Anything that has changed from last year is in red. And just pay close attention to all the dates on these, and we'll go over these in just a minute. The second sheet that you want in front of you when you're doing this is the diagnosis and medication sheet. So this looks at two measures. This first page looks at the two depression measures, shows you a little bit of the difference between the two of them, any of the depression diagnoses that would count for the mental health one measure, and then some tips for the PREV-12 depression screening measure. And this is to help you really figure out the difference between the two of them and make sure that your patient does have the accurate diagnosis of depression to be qualified for that measure. The back page of this is help for PREV-13. That's the statin measure. This gives you a list of some of the diagnoses that could be considered atherosclerotic cardiovascular diseases or potential ICD-10 codes that would count. So an I-20 point anything would count as an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. If the patient has that diagnosis in 2019, then you can answer yes to that question. Here are your three denominator exclusions. There are other exceptions that go along with this measure. And then a list of statin medications that the patient could potentially be on. This is particularly helpful for those of us that are not on the clinical side of things that may be helping to fill out these chart audits, to pull these measures. I don't necessarily know what all constitutes an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, so a sheet like this is very helpful for me as I'm pulling some of these charts. So let's go back to our GPRO submission page. You can sort this by provider. If you have multiple providers in your practice and choose to just look at one at a time, you may sort by provider. Otherwise, it's going to show every patient that was chosen for your practice. If you click on the patient's name, it's going to take you to the claims data for that patient. This is probably not something that you need at this moment. Right now, it's not showing anything because these are claims for 2020, and the patient obviously has not been seen yet this year. So don't click on the patient's name. We're going to click out here either on patient confirmation or on one of the measures that the patient was chosen for. And that is how we're going to actually access the patient. You see all these colorful P's and F's and S's. There's a key up here at the top that shows you what those mean. P's for passes, F for fail, S for skip. We'd like to see the majority of these, of course, to be those green P's, but you are going to have a handful of yellow skips and possibly a few red F's for fails. I'm going to take us down to a patient that has not been completed yet so you can see the process from start to finish. So we're going to look at this patient here. We want to check his date of birth, and then if I were actually looking at this patient, actually filling out the data, I would have my EHR open in a different tab or a different screen. And I would go ahead and pull up this patient in my EHR so I could confirm his date of birth and, if need be, his Medicare ID number. So I'm going to click out here on the first measure that he was chosen for. Now these numbers out here, this 112, 242, 337, those numbers don't mean anything to you. These were the ranks that they were chosen for CMS, anywhere from 1 to 616. Don't worry about the number itself. Just know that if there is a number in that column, then the patient was chosen for that measure. So let's click on this 112 and get into the patient. So the first screen that comes up is a patient confirmation screen. And this is asking, can we locate the patient's medical record? We should have already pulled up the patient in the EHR or pulled their paper chart. And we're going to say yes, that we have found their record. Of course, if for some reason you cannot find that patient's record, you would say no. And then I want to show you there are 4 reasons why a patient would not be qualified for the sample. If If you click on not qualified, then this second drop-down menu opens up for you, and these are the disqualification reasons. There are 4 reasons why a patient would be disqualified for the sample. If the patient was in hospice at any time in 2019, if they moved out of the country, not just to a different state, but actually out of the country where they would not be able to get Medicare, if they are deceased, or if they switched completely away from Medicare. They no longer have Medicare in any way, shape, or form, not as a primary, not as a secondary. They've dropped Medicare completely. I'm not even sure if we've seen this ever chosen in our few years of quality reporting. I have tried to go through and fill in some of the patients that we know are deceased or in hospice. So if you see that this information is already filled out for one of your patients, please confirm that you have that information in your chart as well, that you know the patient was deceased or was in hospice. If you do not have this information and you see that it was already filled in, please contact your consultant, your ACO consultant, for help in getting documentation to update their chart. If you do choose one of these disqualification reasons, you will have to put a date. If you're not completely sure of the date, you can put 12/31/2019, the very last day of the measurement period. And then every measure has a comment box. So if you need to put comments to yourself, comments to the ACO, let us know a little bit more information about this measure. These comments are not turned into CMS. This is strictly for the ACO. So feel free to put anything you want in here to make notes to the ACO or to yourself to remind yourself to come back and change something or update something. So for this patient, we're going to go ahead and say that yes, we found their chart. They're qualified for the sample. You see that the next 2 gray out once we hit yes, because we're not going to disqualify them. And then after every tab, I encourage you to go up here and hit save. Just in case something goes funky with your computer, you want to make sure that you don't have to go back and repeat all of your work that you've just done. So now we get this little green P next to patient confirmation for pass. We have completed this measure and the patient passed the measure. Of course, we found their chart, so they pass. And we're going to move on to the next tab. So this tab is DM2, diabetes, hemoglobin A1C poor control. So CMS considers poor control as a hemoglobin A1C of greater than 9. Now before we start this measure, we want to go back over here to our measure summary chart. We want to find DM2, our diabetes hemoglobin A1C poor control measure. We see that it's for patients aged 18 to 75, so we want to confirm that. Although CMS does a pretty good job of not choosing anyone for this measure that does not fall into the appropriate age range. Then we're going to read the notes here. We're looking for an active diagnosis of type 1 or 2 diabetes during 2019 or 2018, so they can actively have diabetes anytime during the last 2 years. Then we want to determine if the patient had a hemoglobin A1C test performed during 2019, and we want to use the most recent in 2019 and the lab report draw date. At a minimum, the documentation in the medical record must include a note indicating the date on which the hemoglobin A1C test was performed and the result. You see that there are no exclusions or exceptions for this measure. Back over here in this patient reported column, this can be patient reported, meaning that you don't necessarily have to have the lab report as long as the patient can tell you the date that the test was performed, that's the month, the day, and the year, and the value of that. It is, of course, best practice to have that actual lab report in the patient's chart, and you should all be doing hemoglobin A1Cs at least once a year on your diabetic patients, so this should be an easy measure to pass. You'll notice that they do not ask about diabetic eye exam this year. That's kind of nice for us. Please do not stop telling your patients to get their diabetic eye exam. Please do not stop gathering the report and the notes from the ophthalmologists, because this may come back next year. They will more than likely go back to checking the diabetic eye exam in quality reporting next year. So just because it doesn't show up this year does not mean that you should stop actually checking it. A couple of other measures that do not show up this year are the BMI measure and the pneumonia vaccine. Again, does not mean that these are going away. We should still check these on our patients because they may show up in quality reporting next year. So let's go back to our GPRO submission. So the first question is, does the patient have a documented history or active diagnosis of diabetes during the measurement period or the year prior to the measurement period? So we would check this patient's diagnoses in their chart. We would make sure they have an active diagnosis of diabetes in 2019 or 2018, and we would say yes. If you cannot find a diagnosis of diabetes, you would say that this is not a confirmed diagnosis. Now, please use everything in this patient's chart. Anything is available to you. So if there are notes, consult notes from a specialist, if there are notes from a hospital stay, any of that is in your EHR is fair game. So let's look and see if maybe someone else has diagnosed this patient with diabetes. Maybe they are a new diabetic. Check everything at your disposal to look and see if we can find that diagnosis and a current A1C level. You have a third option here for no other CMS approved reason. It is very rare that you would ever choose this. I believe we had 4 of these for the entire ACO last year. But if you choose this, this means that something out of the ordinary is going on with this patient. We're not exactly sure whether to say yes or no for their diagnosis of diabetes. So we reached out to CMS for a little bit more clarification. They talked to us, they gave us a service center case number, which is a long number that we would have to type in here. And they told us whether we needed to actually say yes or no, whether it would be okay to skip this patient for this measure. So again, you're never going to choose this on your own. You would work with your doctor's ACO consultant before choosing this. And it is very rare that this is something that would be chosen. So and this is an option under all the measures, just basically pretend it doesn't exist. And if you have questions about a measure, work with your consultant and we'll help you figure out if this is the appropriate choice. For this patient, we're going to assume that we have found their documentation of diabetes in their chart in 2019 or 2018. That's going to bring us down to the next question was, did the patient have 1 or more hemoglobin A1C tests performed during the measurement period, which is 2019? We're going to say yes, we were able to find a current hemoglobin A1C. We're going to put the date that the hemoglobin A1C was checked. Halloween seems appropriate. We're going to put the value of the hemoglobin A1C. Ideally, it is under 9, showing that they are controlled. If you have an A1C draw date that is maybe earlier in the year, suppose this was January 31st of 2019, and this number was a little bit high, we would definitely want to keep digging in this patient's chart. More than likely, someone else checked this A1C later on in the year. Let's see if we can find a result that is more recent in 2019 and perhaps has a better value. All right, so we're going to confirm that this was the lab draw date. This was the actual hemoglobin A1C that was entered for the patient. And then, of course, we have options here to write some notes if you have any comments to either the ACO or to remind yourself about something. So we have finished everything for this measure. It does an autosave. You see that we've gone ahead and gotten that P for pass next to it, but just go ahead and hit save again before you move to another tab. I do want to point out here that you have a few blue bars here for, this is extra help for you. If we click on exceptions, right here under denominator exclusions and denominator exceptions, you can see that there are none for this measure. And that mirrors what we saw here in our measure summary chart, that there are no exclusions or exceptions. We're going to close this out. You also have your measure specifications here. If you click on that blue tab, then this takes you to the actual web interface specifications from CMS. And this just gives you a little bit more information about the measure, what exactly they're looking for, why they're checking this measure, more descriptions. There again is your denominator exclusions and exceptions, a little bit more guidance. So if there's anything on your measure summary chart that doesn't fully clarify this measure for you, you can go here to your additional guidance, see if you can find the answer. If not, don't hesitate to reach out to your ACO consultant for more help. And then this third bar, the patient profile, will actually take you to the patient's claims data for 2019. So you could actually search by CPT code to see if there was another A1C done on this patient. For example, if I put in the CPT for hemoglobin A1C, the 83036, right here. This would pull up any A1Cs that were completed for this patient in 2019. So you could see who did it, where it was done, the date it was done. And we don't have a value here. So you would have to actually have this report in your chart. But this would maybe help you, like I said, if you had an early one in the year, you wanted to see if maybe patient got one done at another provider or done at the hospital later on in the year that might have a better value. So let's move on to our next measure, hypertension. So again, we're going to go first to our measure summary chart. We're going to find the hypertension measure, this third one here, controlling high blood pressure. We want to determine if the patient has a documented diagnosis of essential or primary hypertension within the first 6 months of 2019 or any time prior to 2019, but does not end before the start of 2019. So the reason why they're looking for within the first 6 months of 2019 or prior is because if a patient was newly diagnosed with hypertension towards the end of the year, it might not be enough time to get their blood pressure down to a controlled level before the end of 2019. We wouldn't want to basically unfairly punish a practice for a new consultation or a new diagnosis of hypertension. We want to make sure that the patient has time to get that blood pressure under control. You do see that it says use the most recent in 2019. Patient more than likely had multiple blood pressure readings in 2019, so we're going to use the one towards the end of the year, the most recent blood pressure. And we're looking for a systolic blood pressure of less than 140 and a diastolic of less than 90. If multiple blood pressure readings were on the same day, you can use the lowest systolic and the lowest diastolic, even if those are from separate readings. Maybe the patient was a little bit flustered when they first got into the office and their systolic was high when they first came in, but their diastolic was normal. And then you checked it again at the end of the visit and both of them were normal. You can use that blood pressure from the end of the visit, or if you need to combine a systolic from one reading and a diastolic from another reading to get under 140 over under 90, then that is allowed. Now, blood pressure readings from the patient's home, including readings directly from monitoring devices, are not acceptable. So if they bring you their list of blood pressures, or if you're doing blood pressure readings from remote patient monitoring, those are not included at this point in this measure. We do have some exclusions and exceptions to this hypertension measure. So it says it can start before or during 2019, but cannot end before the start of 2019. We want to exclude anyone with end-stage renal disease who is actively on dialysis, CKD stage 5, or history of renal transplant before or during 2019. Exclude pregnancy during 2019, and exclude 65 or older in nursing homes or certain group homes or institutions. So if you have a patient that is over 65, they live exclusively in a nursing home, they could be excluded from this measure. Again, your chart must highlight that. You must be able to see clearly in the chart that the patient resides in a nursing home. These certain group homes or settings, if you have a question about the place where a patient resides and if they would be excluded from this measure, reach out to your ACO consultant and we can help you with that. So let's go back to our GPRO submission page. We're going to look in the patient's EHR. We're going to see that they do have a diagnosis of essential primary hypertension in 2019. They've probably had it for a while. We'll say yes. If we cannot find the diagnosis, of course, we'd say not confirmed diagnosis. And if they fell into any of those exclusions, like end-stage renal disease or CKD stage 5, we would choose denominator exclusion. Let's say yes for this patient. Second question is, was the patient's most recent blood pressure reading documented during the measurement period? Did they have their blood pressure checked in 2019? Yes, they did. We're going to put the date that the patient's blood pressure was taken. We're going to put the systolic. We're going to put the diastolic. You see that this patient is very well controlled. And then, of course, you could put notes in here. If this blood pressure taken was very early in the year, maybe in January or February, and you don't have anything more because the patient left your practice, put a note in there. Patient left practice in October of 2019. This saves me from doing some extra digging. If I see a date of September, maybe July, something like that, I'm going to really dig into the patient's claims data and see if they've had a more recent blood pressure, just to make sure we're in compliance. If you give me a note like this, the patient left the practice, so indicating that you wouldn't have any notes for them after October of 2019, that's going to save me a little bit of digging. Of course, that's not required, but that just helps us out on the ACO end. And again, we're going to hit save, and then we'll move on to the next measure. So the mental health measure, depression remission at 12 months. There are actually two mental health measures that show up in GPRO reporting this year. I'm going to show you both of these on the measure summary chart. This one that we're about to answer is the depression remission at 12 months, MH1, or mental health 1. What this is looking for is patients that have an active diagnosis of major depression or dysthymia. They want to know, for patients that already have the diagnosis of depression, did they get two depression screens, two PHQ-9 depression screens, about a year apart from each other? So first, did they receive one within this index period of November 1st, 2017 to October 31st, 2018? If they did get a PHQ-9 done during that index period, was the score greater than 9, indicating depression? If you said yes to that, then we would want to know, did the patient have another PHQ-9 done 12 months from the index date plus or minus 60 days? And then if they did have that one done about a year after the first one, was that score less than 9, indicating that the depression is now in remission? So this is a little bit of a complex measure. However, if you are doing the annual wellness visit and completing a PHQ-9 at the annual wellness visit and doing it basically at the same time every year, this becomes an easier and easier measure to pass year over year. So please pay close attention to your dates as you're filling this out. Remember that we're looking first for an active diagnosis of major depression. And if we go back here to our diagnosis and meds cheat sheet, the first page has all the ICD-10 codes that would count as major depression or dysthymia that would qualify the patient for that measure. Oops. Let's go back here. Let me point out the exclusions to this measure. So we want to exclude patients who have an active diagnosis of bipolar disorder, personality disorder, schizophrenia, or psychotic disorder, pervasive developmental disorders, or who were permanent nursing home residents in 2019. So there are quite a few exclusions to this measure. Again, your chart must indicate one of these things if you are to choose exclusion. So let's go back. Does the patient have an active diagnosis of major depression? Let's say that no, we could not find an active diagnosis of major depression for this patient. They weren't depressed. They don't have the diagnosis. And we also looked in the notes from their specialist. We looked in the notes from the hospital, from the nursing home. Well, they would be excluded if they were in the nursing home, so we'll pretend I didn't say that. but we've looked everywhere and we can't find that diagnosis. So if you put not a confirmed diagnosis, the rest of these stay grayed out. We don't have to fill out anything else for that patient. And you see we get a yellow S here under the mental health measure for skip. We've skipped this patient. They don't qualify for this measure, basically, because they didn't have the diagnosis. So we will skip them over when we are looking at our reports for this measure. Again, we're going to hit save, and we're going to move on. Prev 6 is colorectal cancer screening. Let's find Prev 6 down here at the very bottom. This is for patients 50 to 75. We want to determine if the colorectal screening is current during 2019, and it lists for you multiple different types of colorectal cancer screenings that would count for this measure and the dates for which they need to be done within. So, of course, a colonoscopy is good for 10 years. Cologuard is good for 3 years. An FOBT, it has to be done during 2019. That's only good for 1 year. And there is a note down here that documentation must include both of the following: a note indicating the date that the colorectal cancer screening was performed and the result or findings. Documentation of normal or abnormal is acceptable. So if you are only asking the question in your annual wellness visit, did you have a colonoscopy? And they say yes, and they tell you it was in 2014, that is not enough to pass this measure. We do have to have the results or findings from that. If they were able to tell you if the scan was normal or abnormal, then that counts. Otherwise, we need to have the actual documentation from the GI specialist for this. Exclusions over here: documentation of diagnosis or past history of a total colectomy or colorectal cancer would exclude them from this measure. And again, we're excluding 65 or older that are in a nursing home or certain group homes and institutions in 2019. So pay close attention to your dates on this. Same with the breast cancer screening. You've got a date range here for when the mammogram could be done within. Pay close attention to that. Mammograms are for patients 50 to 74. So no, you do not have to do a mammogram on your 93-year-old patients. Your exclusions for mammograms are documentation of bilateral mastectomy or right and left unilateral mastectomies. If they only had one breast removed, it is expected that you're going to do a mammogram on the other one. So just a single mastectomy does not disqualify them from this measure. So let's go back to our patient here. Is the patient qualified? We're going to say yes. He's not had colorectal cancer in the past. He doesn't fit any of those exclusions, so yes, he's qualified. And let's say no, maybe we weren't able to find that. Maybe the patient refuses. He just absolutely refuses to do anything, even that stool card in the office. We can put a note down here for that. We're going to hit save. And you see, because we did not get this colorectal cancer done, we get this red F. He does fail this measure. And you are going to have a few of those, hopefully not too many. Moving through influenza, we're going to check his notes and see. This is one where you might not always have the records in your chart, because patients do go to CVS and Publix and that kind of stuff to get their flu shots. If you say no to this measure, of course, the ACO is going to go back and check and see if we find any claims data. If we do find that they had the flu shot somewhere, we will let you know when and where they got it so that you can reach out and get that report into the chart. You could also call the patient and ask them when they got it. As long as they know the month that they did it in and where they did it, you can update the patient's chart to indicate that they did get a flu shot. There are multiple reasons why they would be an exception for this measure. Let's go back to our measure summary chart here for flu shot, and that's on the next page. So first off, I want to remind you that we're looking at last year's flu season. We're looking at August 1st, 2018 through March 31st, 2019, since we are currently still in the 2019-2020 flu season. We're looking back at last year's. So we're looking for a flu shot during that time. or documentation of patient refused will pass this measure. There are only 2 measures in GPRO this year that will pass with a patient refusal, and that is flu shot and depression screening. And that's screening for patients that do not already have depression. We'll go over that one in just a second. But if it's documented in the chart that the patient refused, then that is considered a patient reason exception for not receiving the flu shot. And you can put patient reason over here, denominator exclusion for patient reason. Please tell me down here, patient refuses flu shots, to back this up. You also have medical reasons. If the patient has an egg allergy or a previous adverse reaction to flu shots, you can, and that's indicated in the chart, you could choose medical reasons. System reasons would be maybe there was a shortage of flu vaccines, you could not get any into your clinic and were not able to offer that to a patient. I don't think we had much shortage last year, so that shouldn't be something that you have to choose. But you can choose patient reasons for patient refusals for this one. And when we hit save, we will see that we get a pass. Normally an exception would indicate a skip for that patient, but for this measure we do get a pass. Moving on to Prev 10, tobacco use. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Again, we want to look at our measure summary chart before we answer our question. Was the patient screened for tobacco use at least once from January of 2018 through the end of December 2019? So it's giving you 2 years where they screened at some time during those 2 years. Were they indicated to be a tobacco user or a smoker? And if so, did they get some sort of cessation intervention, some kind of counseling on how to quit, or medications that were available? Maybe you gave them the number to the Georgia quit line. Anything like that would be considered intervention, cessation intervention. You do have a couple of exceptions. Medical reasons for not screening for tobacco use or providing cessation intervention would be limited life expectancy or other medical reasons why. If you have a 80-year-old with stage 4 lung cancer who has smoked since he was 15 years old and he's told you for the last 20 years that there's no way he's giving up his cigarettes, and that's noted in the chart, that would be a medical reason for not screening for tobacco use, and you could choose that option. Patient qualified, yes they are. Were they screened? Let's say yes that they were. Were they identified as a tobacco user? Maybe this guy is a smoker. So did the patient receive tobacco cessation intervention? Yes, of course we talked to him about how to quit. Okay, Prev 12. So this is the other depression measure. And the difference between this measure and the mental health measure from previous is that this is looking for patients that do not already have that diagnosis of depression. So in our measure summary sheet here, first we're going to determine if the patient was screened for clinical depression in 2019. And if we look over here at the exclusions or exceptions, we see that a documentation of an active diagnosis for depression or bipolar disorder prior to 2019 is considered an exclusion or an exception for this measure. So we are actively looking for patients that do not have clinical depression at this time. We are offering a screening in 2019 to see if they do have depression. If they do test positive for that, if they score 9 or greater on that PHQ-9 or score positive on any of these other standardized screening tools, then they would be considered positive for depression and they would need some sort of counseling on that. That could be a referral to a psychiatrist. That would count as a follow-up plan for your depression. Documentation of patient refused will pass this measure as well. So again, very important to read all of these as you're going through, especially the exceptions and exclusions, to make sure that you are able to exclude someone that wouldn't be appropriate for this measure. So let's assume that yes, this patient was qualified because they did not already have depression, and yes, they received an age-appropriate screening tool during 2019. And note, they were not positive for depression, so we did not have to offer any follow-up plan because they were not positive. Save. And finally, Prev 13. So this is statin therapy for the prevention and treatment of cardiovascular disease. Now, this measure is a little long because it's looking at 3 different populations of patients. Let's go and look at our measure summary chart. So this identifies the 3 separate populations and what we're looking for. And then if they fall into any of these categories, we want to know if the patient is taking or prescribed statin therapy during 2019. If you as the physician prescribed the statin, whether or not the patient took it doesn't matter. If they were prescribed it, then you would get to say, yes, they were prescribed statin therapy during 2019. There are a few exclusions to this and exceptions. If the patient has end-stage renal disease, statin tolerance would be considered a medical reason, active liver or hepatic disease, or a diabetic whose most recent fasting LDL lab test was less than 70. This is all outlined here in your cheat sheet. The orange side of this. Again, it shows you some of those atherosclerotic cardiovascular diseases and the statin therapy that they could be taking, your denominator exclusions here. So if we were filling out this measure for this patient, this first line is the first population of patients. Does the patient have a diagnosis of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, active or history of, at any time up through the end of 2019. So this can be a previous diagnosis, it can be an active diagnosis. If we say yes to this, if they do have this, then none of these other populations of patients open up. We just need to say whether they're taking a statin or not. Because they fall into that first patient population, Medicare doesn't care about the other ones, so we just go down to the statin measure. If we were to say no to this one, they did not have that active diagnosis of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, then the second population of patients opens up for us to look at. Have they ever had a fasting or direct laboratory test result of an LDL greater than 190? Or do they have an active diagnosis of familial or pure hypercholesterolemia? So either this lab test of LDL over 190, I should say greater than or equal to 190, or the diagnosis of familial or pure hypercholesterolemia. So we check that patient's records. Again, every record that's at our disposal, anything coming from the cardiologist will work for this, anything from the hospitals, the urgent care, anything like that. So we're going to say, nope, we couldn't find that diagnosis either. He doesn't actually have that. So then you see that this popped up in red. There's an autosave function in BlueSky here, so it just automatically saved it. It noticed that we hadn't answered this question quick enough, and so there was nothing there when it autosaved. That's why it turned red. It was just waiting for us to put something there. But because we said no to the second population, now we have to answer the question about the third population of patients. Is this patient 40 to 75? Do they have a diagnosis of type 1 or type 2 diabetes? Let's say, well, yes, they actually are a diabetic. Then to go along with this one, does this diabetic patient have an LDL level between 70 and 189? Diabetics at a slightly lower LDL level are considered at increased risk for cardiovascular disease, according to this measure. So maybe we've checked his lab values and he has an LDL of 80. So we're going to say, yes, he does. And then we're going to want to know whether he's taken a statin or not. We will say yes, that he is taking his statins as prescribed. This little caution sign here, again, is because we hadn't answered this question quick enough. If you were to leave something blank or to put a date that was outside of a date range and you hit save, you'll see this caution sign pop up, and that's an indication that something's wrong here, something's off. We need you to change one of these answers to fit within this measure specifications. If you think you've answered everything correctly and you still have this, hit save one more time, and a lot of times that'll clear it out, as it did with us. Okay, so now we have answered all of these measures to the best of our abilities with everything in our EHR, in our paper chart. We've called and procured reports for mammograms and colonoscopies if we didn't have them. We've done everything we think we need to do for this patient. If we are happy with where we are, we can now hit the send for approval button. And you will get this pop-up that basically says, for the measures that I passed, I understand that the provider exercised their independent medical judgment in making these diagnoses. I have answered these questions to the best of my ability, and everything in here is truthful. It is much more important to put a true and accurate answer to this than to actually pass the measure. Please do not lie on any of these. It's very important that we answer these 100% truthfully. About a quarter of ACOs end up getting audited in this GPRO. And if they audit us and we find that a lot of these we cannot back up with the EHR records, then our score will definitely drop. Excuse me. The second part, this is showing that we had 2 of them that were deficient. Either they failed or they were skips, and we are acknowledging that, yes, I understand that I did fail or skip these measures, and I'm okay with that. I've done everything I can. You can, of course, write some comments in here. You would say, I accept, and then you will get this nice blue bar up at the top that says, this GPRO form has been submitted to ACO corporate personnel for approval. Please check back later. That ACO corporate personnel is mostly going to be me or one of the other ACO consultants. We're going to check over all of your answers, compare any skips or fails to the claims data that we see, and see if we can change any of these answers to turn any skips or fails into passes. So we have finished this patient. We're going to go up here to the X in the green bar. And now we see that this patient we were working on here has a status of ready for approval, just waiting for the ACO to approve. And now we have colorful letters next to all of the measures here for that patient. Once you send it for approval, you are not able to go back and edit. So please make sure that you are happy with all the answers before you send it to approval. Now, if I were to not approve this patient for any reason, then you will be able to go back and edit some of these, add more information, or give me notes and say that I've done everything I can. There's nothing else I can do for this patient. So you will go through and complete all of these patients. Okay. Please notice down here at the bottom, it stops at 25 on this page, and this practice has multiple pages to complete, or this ACO has multiple pages to complete. So don't forget to move on to the second page and the third page. Don't think that yours stops at 25, although some of them will. You will occasionally see I don't see any of them right now, but you'll see a red star next to some of your patients. And if we look up here, a red star indicates that this patient was selected for a quality audit. So again, that would mean that you need to send all of the records for that patient, everything that would pass, that would back up these measures. Here's a patient here, Miss Marie Allen, has a red star indicating that she was chosen for quality reporting. And I think if we click on her, no, it doesn't indicate it here, but those, you can see that she's been sent for approval a couple of times. Approval was denied. And we have the option to edit her again. But please, for anyone that's chosen for a QA, go ahead and send the records of all of the measures to the ACO securely if you're emailing them, or your consultant can come and pick them up in person to back up the answers that you put for all of the measures for that patient. So this is not difficult. a lot of your patients were just chosen for 1 or 2 of the measures. It should go pretty quickly. I wanted to show you over here in the GPRO Progress, where we started at the very beginning. You can filter this either by practice, which for most of you will just be 1 practice. You can also filter by measure. And if you filter by measure, then you can see the total number of patients that were chosen for each of these measures. These numbers are a little high because we're looking at multiple practices. More than likely, this is what you're going to look for. So, for example, if you wanted to put someone at the front desk or one of your MAs in charge of checking all of the breast cancer screenings, you could give them this list of 11 patients that were chosen for the measure and say, I need you to go through all 11 of these charts and see if these patients are up to date on their breast cancer screening. If not, please reach out and maybe reach out to the patient and find out if they got a mammogram and if they did, where, so that you can get the results and update that patient's chart. So you could break it down like this if there are multiple people helping, or if you want to just focus on 1 measure at a time. Okay, so hopefully that was a helpful walkthrough of the GPRO submission process for 2019. If you need to add additional access to BlueSky for someone new in your clinic or someone that hasn't had it in the past, please reach out to your ACO consultant. If you have questions, and you're going to have questions about this stuff, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We would be happy to answer any and all questions about GPRO reporting. We would like to have this all finished up, ideally by the end of January or maybe very early February. Have all of our information back from our practices so that the ACO can spend plenty of time going through the claims data to see if there are any skips and fails that we can change over to passes. Good luck. Thank you for attending this training. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to me or to any of your other consultants.